A Heroine's Beginning, Chapter 25. I returned to the celebration once I had calmed down. Alexander was the most comforting presence. He stayed with me as long as I needed, and shooed away James when he came to give me the water. As much as I liked James, at the moment, I just wanted to be left with my brother. Alexander did not push at what was bothering me. He only asked if it was about Ella, and I nodded. Once I had cleaned myself up, and tried to stop feeling so guilty, Alexander guided me back into the ballroom, and told me to wait for a moment. A few minutes later, he returned with Ella. Her look of concern broke my heart. She really was the sweetest person. I desperately did not want to ruin her wedding day. She did not yet know the full extent of her stepmother's cruelty, and I did not want to ruin the best day of her life. I decided to let her new husband break the news to her when the time was right. "Marian, are you all right? Your brother seemed worried," she asked me. "I'm fine, really," I replied, not believing a word of it. "Marian." My mind panicked, trying to think of some excuse that wouldn't involve giving away the real reason behind my foul mood. "It's only that my course has arrived, and I'm feeling emotional," I told her. It was quite possibly the worst excuse on the planet. "Really, Marian?" she said. It was evident she didn't believe a word of it. "Yes, it's your wedding day, and I'm allowed to feel emotional," I said. Her expression didn't change. She was waiting for me to tell her the real reason. I was frantically trying to think of literally anything that would relieve me from this situation. An idea struck me. "It's really, well, this is going to sound silly, but it's so lovely to see you so happy, and you deserve to be. But I'm certain I'm never going to find what you and Christopher have, even if I look for 1,000 years. "What are you talking about? Everyone can find love," she cried. Apparently she bought it. "Ella, I've never really spoken to a man, other than James, and after this celebration, I'm going to go back home to a life of cooking and cleaning for my family. It's not going to happen." "Don't be so ridiculous. I met Christopher completely by chance in the forest, while I was still cooking and cleaning for my family. Love can always turn up in places you least expect it. Now come on, I'm not going to permit this type of talk at my wedding." "All right, if the bride commands." "I do. Now you must go dance with someone, especially if you're so worried about never finding the love of your life. My mother always used to say, fate can only get you as far as putting the two of you together in the same place. The rest is up to you." Even though I didn't need the advice, I could appreciate it all the same. So I thanked her and told her to return to her new husband. He must have been missing her by that point. She didn't argue and left immediately to go find him. I skirted around the edge of the ballroom. Observing the dancers was quite entertaining. They moved with the rhythm and flowed so gracefully. They looked like a stream of water. I spotted various members of my family dotted around the room. Gwen was still playing with Lizzie and Lottie. Richard had found a boy his own age to converse with. Daniel was actually talking to a girl. As I watched, I noticed that she laughed a lot at whatever he was saying. That didn't surprise me. Daniel had always been the joker of the family, and his sarcastic manner of speaking often left people in hysterics. I adjusted my position. For a while now I had been leaning against a wall, lost in thought, and my side was now in slight pain. My corseted dress was not helping on that account. How high-born women wore them every day I would never know. My gaze wandered to Ella, who was talking to the Duke. They seemed friendly enough with each other. Of course it would be Ella, to make one of the sternest people in the county like her. I could see Christopher conversing with some wedding guests, one of whom I recognized as the aloof man I danced with briefly at the ball. While Christopher looked perfectly content, his friend wore a scowl, like he was in a perpetually bad mood. I also noticed that Christopher would frequently turn away from his conversation to glance at his blushing bride. I tried to spot the rest of my family, but another target caught my eye. James was stood not 30 feet away from me, talking with a lady. Her shimmering black hair seemed to taunt me slightly, as it moved while she laughed at something he had said. My heart stopped. He had his back to me, so I could not gauge his reaction to the conversation. But if it was anything similar to the raven-haired lady's feelings, then he was certainly enjoying himself. In my head, I knew I had absolutely no right to be jealous. I had known James a grand total of 1 month, and in that time, he had never suggested that I was anyone special to him, and I don't think I had ever told him my true feelings toward him. I hadn't had the chance. After all, I had only really discovered them earlier that day, but that did not make any of the feelings disappear. I had just thought... I never completed that sentence in my head. I had never experienced jealousy before. I had only read about it in books and stories. It drove people to all sorts of unpleasant things, and I was beginning to understand why. It did truly feel like a stab of ice through the heart. I tried to ignore it. I truly did. But I was still feeling down over what had happened to Ella, and I think in my vulnerable state, my mind decided to fixate on the reaction I hadn't even seen James give, and make my emotions go far higher than they should have been. I breathed deeply, damming my corset in my mind. My foot took 1 step in the opposite direction of where James was stood, and my other foot followed. The next step was easier, and then the next. I could feel the tears pricking at the edges of my eyes again. I choked them down. I was not some pathetic child who cried every time something didn't go their way. I was a strong young woman who could keep her feelings in check for the rest of the celebration. My feet unconsciously led me back to where my father stood. He was enjoying a glass of fine wine, and looked a little lost. I thought that, living his entire life under these people's shadows, meant that he feared talking to the higher-born guests a little. I understood him. I was still scared to talk to the Duke, and I would never have spoken to James or Christopher, had they not tried engaging with me first. "Ah, Marion, there you are." He spoke to me gently. "What happened to that charming young man you know?" "He is otherwise entertained," I replied, hearing the icy tone that lined my own voice, making it sound foreign to me. "Oh, he's one of those young men, is he?" Father asked. I simply nodded. "Well, forget about him," he said. "You're far too feisty to let him get away with that, so it's better just to forget him now." I started to blush. I stammered a little. He and I, we're not—" "Marion, please. I'm not blind." "I know you're not, but—" "And I think I know you well enough to work out your feelings on the matter." "But—" "And I know you're far, far too good for him." "Father—" "What? It's the truth." I rolled my eyes. I had never had a conversation with my father about young men before, and it was quickly embarrassing me. "Father, I don't want to talk about it, please." "Okay, but if he comes up to me, do I have your permission to punch him?" "Of course not." "Why not? I can tell you're mad." "Because this is Ella's wedding, and you will not disturb it by starting a fight." "Fine. I'll just stare at him until he gets the message." "Please don't do anything." "All right." We stood there in silence for a minute. "Why don't you dance?" my father asked me. "It's a wedding celebration. You should be dancing." "I haven't been asked to." "And? When has a small thing like that ever stopped you before?" I smiled at him. Although I was terrible at dancing like a lady, there were a few easy country dances I knew quite well. If only I had a contact who could get the orchestra to play a certain piece of music. Oh, wait, I was one of Ella's bridesmaids. I scanned the room to find Ella. It wasn't like she was particularly difficult to find, with her golden hair and white dress. She appeared to be finishing her conversation with the Duke, and so I made my way over to her. She waved as she saw me approach her, and excused herself promptly from the Duke. "Marion, found any charming young men yet?" she joked. "No, but I have an idea." I made sure to drop my voice so the surrounding nobility did not hear. I knew they would disapprove of my plan. Ella, on the other hand, seemed rather captured by the idea, and she beamed at me. "Leave it to me," she said excitedly. I tasked myself with rounding up people who might go along with my idea. My siblings, my father, Jacqueline, and myself. Ella said she would bring her new husband, and he would try to find some people who were up for it. Once the orchestra finished the minuet, I saw Ella talk quickly to the conductor. He nodded, and she made her way back to the center of the room, near where I was stood. She gave me a conspiratorial wink and nodded to the conductor, who was ready to announce the next set of music. "The next dance is a request from the new Lady Howards. This apparently is a popular dance from her home." There were about 16 of us who stood in a circle in the center of the ballroom. The nobles looked very confused, but they stepped aside and gave us space to make our large circle. The fiddle started to play a melody I was familiar with. It was a country jig. In our village, every single year at the May Day celebrations, there was a maypole in the center of the square. This maypole had several different colored pieces of ribbon attached to it, and they were so long that children were able to hold on to them. The maypole dancing consisted of several repetitive steps that, when done with the ribbon, made a pattern around the maypole. And so, in the center of the ballroom at the Duke's palace, we began our maypole dance. Without the ribbons, of course. It began simply. Every second person in the circle would remain still, while the others would skip around them before moving on to the next person. My father was a still person, and so began to clap in time with the beat, and the others eventually caught on. I was a mobile person, and was trying to keep my steps in time with the music. I could see that most of the room was staring at us now, but I didn't care. I was enjoying myself, so I let them stare. I eventually returned to my original spot in the circle, and waited while those who were still became the mobile ones. I continued to clap in time with the beat. The one problem I encountered was now that I had stopped moving, it meant that I could look around the room properly. And of course, there was one person stood opposite from me in the crowd who I recognized. James. I couldn't quite tell if his expression was one of awe or disapproval. He caught my eye for a second, and I was about to smile at him, until I noticed the mass of black hair beside him, and then I averted my gaze quickly. My attention returned to the dance, as the mobile people were almost back in their places now. Once they returned, we all held hands and galloped around the center of the circle, left and back again, followed by the first group of mobile people skipping into the center and back out again, and then the second group doing the same. The dance then repeated in reverse. As with an actual maypole present, it is necessary to untie all the ribbons from the spiderweb pattern that's created during the dance. Thankfully, due to the skipping around in the circle, my spot had changed slightly, so now I was no longer directly facing James. I didn't want to have to look at his smug face. Maybe that's why he always appeared so arrogant. He was used to women just falling all over him, and I was just another one. I tried to ignore these thoughts and focus on the dance. It was over rather quickly. It wasn't a very complicated dance, and the fiddle drew its final chord. The crowd erupted into applause, but I could not tell if they were genuinely happy or just glad that the dance was over. It didn't matter much in any case, as Ella whispered something into Christopher's ear, and he smiled at her before starting to speak in a loud voice. "The next dance will be a country reel. Anyone who knows the steps is welcome to join." Most of the high-born lords and ladies didn't move, and looked slightly offended at the insinuation they would know the steps to a commoner dance. The only movement that happened was from some of the guests who moved out of the way of someone else coming through. The person finally made it to the center. His bright red hair would make him stand out anywhere. Jack smiled at me and moved to stand next to me. My father gave me a confused look, and I glared back at him, with a clear message of, "I'll tell you later." "This dance requires all persons to have a partner," Christopher told the crowd. "Are there any young ladies here who would like to pair up with these fine young gentlemen?" I noticed that the majority of the group was comprised of males, my 5 brothers and father, and a few of Christopher's friends. There was only myself, Ella, Jacqueline, Clara, and Gwen as the females for this dance. Robbie paired with Gwen, Clara paired with one of Christopher's highborns, Jacqueline paired with Daniel, and of course Ella and Christopher were together. Jack turned his head to me. "Will you do me the honor of taking me for your dance partner?" I nodded my response. No one in the crowd made an effort to move. That was until Christopher gestured to some people at the edge of the room. "You know this one," he said to someone. They started to make their way through the people until eventually they reached the front. I knew them. They were some of the maids who had helped me yesterday. There were 3 of them, all dressed in their best uniform, clean and freshly pressed. They gave a little giggle as Alexander and 2 of Christopher's highborns asked them to dance. The last movement to occur was quite tumultuous, as little Lizzie and Lottie made their way to us, and they were the ones to ask Tom and Richard to dance. My father agreed to sit this dance out and observe. I noticed he conveniently placed himself in the crowd as to block James's view of the dance. Everyone was now paired up, and we took our places. We stood in 2 lines, facing our partner. Once again, the steps were very simple, simply moving back and forwards, joining hands with our partner, and reeling down the line. Then the top couple would skip down to the end of the line and make a bridge, while the other couples went underneath. Jack smiled at me as we started to move forward and back, pulling a funny face when we got close to each other. Laughter bubbled up inside me, and I giggled a little. Christopher and Ella were the first top couple, and they skipped down the line while everyone clapped in time with the beat. Their eyes never left each other's, all the way down. We started to cast off down the line and go through the tunnel they had created. Jack reached for my hand as we went under, and once our hands met, I was once again struck by the spark of electricity, which forced my hand to recoil slightly, before recovering and grasping Jack's hand again. I could tell he had felt it too. The final step in the pattern was to swing your partner, which simply involved holding each other like you would at a waltz, and spinning rapidly. Jack held out his arms, and I got inside them, standing close as we spun. His face tipped down while we moved, his cheek just brushing the top of my head. In a matter of moments, the spinning was over, and we parted to go back down our lines. The dance repeated, as Christopher and Ella were now at the bottom of the line. So there was now Alexander and a maid at the top of the line. As we moved, I noticed a small movement in the crowd behind where Jack's head was. James's face appeared in line with my vision, still with the same expression that I could not tell the meaning of. I tried to ignore him and focus on the dance. It continued much the same way, until eventually I found Jack and myself at the top of the line. Whilst all the other couples had simply joined both hands and skipped down the center, Jack held out both his arms to me again, surprising me a little, as we stood in the same position for waltzing or spinning. There was slightly more distance between us this time, as we needed to be able to skip down the line. But this also meant that we were now able to stand face to face with each other. Jack had clearly done this before, as he not only led me skipping down the center, but also began to spin us at the same time. I barely noticed anything else. I was concentrating on how to stay upright. Jack whispered to me, "Follow my lead," and we did manage to get to the end of the line in one piece. Once we stopped and made the bridge, Jack beamed at me, and I smiled back. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my father raise his eyebrow at me in an inquisitorial fashion. I chose to ignore him. I knew he would get it out of me later. Before that moment, I was content just to be at the center of the ball, dancing with a friend, wearing a fine gown, and purely enjoying myself for a short amount of time. If time could have stood still for a moment of my life, that would have been the moment I chose. For that moment led to so much more, and after that day, my life would never quite be the same again. But perhaps that's a story for another time. The end of Part 1. Don't worry, Marion's story is far from over. Be sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss A Heroine's Adventure, Part 2 of Marion's story. Thank you for listening.